Welcome to the grief journey, a journey that I'm personally on, and I know that there are a lot of people following me who are going through intense grief. And I'm going through a series on grief, not only what are all the different theories and cultural implications around grief, but also how do you actually practically move through these things if you are experiencing intense grief. I'm Christy Bundakumar, Dr. B, psychiatric nurse practitioner, but I've also lost children, and I am trying to grieve in a healthy way and sharing that publicly so that we can all learn and grow. Today I'm talking about the book The Grieving Brain by Mary Frances O'Connor, and I thought this was a great kind of review of a lot of grief theories and practical explanations. I definitely feel like if you are experiencing intense grief and you improve by learning, which is her whole theory, that this would be a good book to go through. So when Mary Frances O'Connor is talking about the grieving brain, she does use a lot of neuroscience in her explanations. And as a nurse practitioner, I really appreciate that. I love to kind of think about what neural pathways are going on, what areas of the brain are impacted. I even went to the Amen Clinic and got a SPECT scan for myself to kind of evaluate what grief is doing to the brain. So that kind of science is very interesting to me, and I think it's important that we review these things because we often feel just the mental and spiritual impact of grief rather than thinking that there's an actual neurobiology process going on. And so, she starts off the book talking about that grief is a form of learning and then relearning, like learning how to lose and then learning how to reinvest or embrace life. And so the whole concept around the book is this kind of learning and relearning. And we know that natural grief is, obviously a learning process. And, the more you have gone through, the better your coping skills. But when intense grief hits you unexpectedly, many more things are happening, including neurobiology. So she goes on to talk about closeness as a dimension, which I talk about in another video on the attachment theory with grief. But I really like the way she explains it here. She uses the word brain map. As a nurse practitioner, I know that is like neural pathways in our brain. So I can give you an example for me. My children had DRPLA, and so there was a lot of kind of medical care for my son and some anticipatory grief around my daughter, but she was actually doing really well, and I had all these hopes and dreams that she was going to live 10 plus more years. I had big vacations planned and time spent with her planned, and so I had these neural pathways in my brain. I'd come home from work every day and I would get my hug, right? And I would spend some time with her watching TV. We'd, do dinner together. Like every day there was this process. Every day I woke up, I got her started on her day. And, on the weekends it was, all of this time together. And so I have this brain map of Maya, right? These neural pathways of what you do and the time spent with that person, your responsibility to them, your closeness to them, your intimacy with them, and that creates neural pathways in your brain. And when she talks about this, she talks about the dimension of closeness, specifically in intense grief, right? Like my daughter gave no warning. She was not sick. She died in her sleep. So there was this immediate break in all of those neural pathways. Immediately, I'm coming home to no hug. And I'm even getting choked up talking about it, right? Because this was a brain map in my head that these things were, permanent in my life. And so when those things get abruptly broken, you could have like events, she called them magical thinking. In extreme cases, they can be depersonalization and derealization, and I have a video that talks about that. But this magical thinking of, let's say you come home and you make dinner as if, you were going to sit down with your loved one and eat together, right? Like the neural pathway is still going, even though there's this permanent loss. And she talks about really the neurobiology that's happening in grief. And I think it's a good thing to know, especially if you're going through intense grief, because it makes it make sense from a neurobiology standpoint, rather than maybe feeling like you're going crazy, right? And, especially in those, early phases where, other theories kind of talk about, denial or, numbing and not being present. Those things are all actual neural pathways that got broken in your brain, and your brain hasn't created a new neural pathway. Okay, so that I felt like that was very comforting. Is probably not the right word, but it helped to know that grief, and those attachments are actually neural pathways. And even if it's, like my mother, I expect my mother to answer the phone when I call or call me back, right? Like that is a neural pathway that I know if I'm upset, I can reach out to my mother, right? If my mother passes, that neural pathway is broken. And this is where she talks about the closeness of dimension. I might have 4 or 5 neural pathways that are directly associated with my mother because I'm 50, I don't live in the same state. Like the dimension of closeness, although I would grieve and I would love my mother, there's nothing wrong with our relationship, the dimension of closeness is not the same as my husband or my children, who there's likely hundreds of neural pathways that were abruptly broken. And so, she talks about learning versus relearning. Like, I have to learn not only to sever that broken neural pathway, but I have to relearn how, create new neural pathways around that. So pretty interesting stuff. She goes on to talk about prolonged grief disorder, which I talk about in another video. She talks about attachment, which I also talk about in another video. But she dedicates almost one whole chapter, maybe 2 chapters, on remembering versus ruminating. And I talk about this a lot. I talk about it kind of in the context of the 10 categories of the Mentally Strong Method, of that rumination is really negative talk. But it's very easy to do in intense grief. Like, we say you need to do grief work. We say you need to take the time and go through those memories and feel the pain, right? But how do you feel that pain and remember? And I say process and cherish versus ruminate. Ruminating is, kind of getting stuck in negative loops. And so if you go back to her concept on this brain map, if you had all of these neural connections, right, and they were abruptly severed, and then you go as a maladaptive coping, you go into rumination, where you're ruminating on negative things, you are creating new neural pathways, but they're negative neural pathways. So she really kind of talks a lot about that. And, I talk about that in Controlled Grief also, like keeping the grief in a cherished place and dealing with those negative things, that negative dialogue differently, right? Because that negative dialogue we need to try to get rid of. Our grief we need to cherish. We need to cherish that relationship that we had with that person. She goes on to kind of give some actions that you can do, mindfulness, counseling, some different techniques. So again, overall, I think it was a really good book. For me, what I learned is kind of that, with my children, I had hundreds of neural pathways around that connection. And even as I've worked through some of my spiritual conflict and I have some energetic connection to them, it's not hundreds of neural pathways as if you had them to hold. So just, kind of giving me that knowledge, and so that I can give myself grace in kind of redoing those neural pathways, like finding ways to reinvest in life, embracing life, finding new connections. So that is Mary Frances O'Connor and the Grieving Brain. We will have a link to her book. This is not my work, this is her work. And keep following. We are on this grief journey together, and I truly believe that you are mentally strong.